Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the War of the Rebellion podcast. And I am really excited to have an old friend of mine today on the podcast to talk about his new book. Unfortunately, neither of us is dressed for the occasion of this being a Christmas episode that we're recording in early November. But it is a Christmas story that we're going to tell today, which is even more exciting. I'm very glad that the publisher reached out and suggested the book. So, coming today to you, of course, I am your host, Niels Eichhorn, here in North Germany, jet lagged from a week in the States. And I'm going to chat today with Robert May or Bob May. And for importance purposes, if you are going to confuse him with the Harvard professor by the same name, Robert E. May. Um, Bob was a professor of history at Purdue University for a long time. He is the author of a number of books related to Southern expansionism into the Caribbean, including Southern Dream of Caribbean Empire, Manifest Destiny Underworld, Slavery, Race, and Conquest in the Tropics. Um, and today we're going to talk about his new book that came out with Bloomsbury, Debunking the Yule Log Myth, the disturbing history of a plantation legend. So, Bob, first of all, thank you for taking the time today, bridging 9 hours of time difference to join me.
Delighted to be on your excellent podcast.
Thank you. So this is technically your second book on Christmas stories, Christmas myth, and tell us how a person that is usually interested in Southern expansionism, fire eaters, and the Caribbean basin all of a sudden writes about Christmas.
Well, there is a connection actually, and the one did lead naturally into the other. My second book was a biography of John Quitman. It was called John A. Quitman, Old South Crusader, and he was one of the leading Southern fire eaters, that is, secessionists, and he was also one of the South's leading territorial expansionists, especially partly to Texas. He took a part in the Texas Revolution, but more importantly to me, he wanted slavery to expand into the Caribbean as a way of protecting Southern interests in the Union or in a Southern empire because he didn't know which way it would go for a while. And so I spent years researching my biography of John Quitman. I'd say about a whole decade of research and writing. It was by far the longest project of my career, I think. And as I worked on it, and I read his family letters and diary materials and other stuff. I realized that Christmas was a very important holiday to white Southerners, and they talked not only a lot about visitors and what they did in the household over the holiday, but especially how the holiday affected their enslaved populations, especially the servants in the big mansion in Natchez, Mississippi. And I realized I took an interest in it from the start. And when I got my biography published, I decided that one of the things I wanted to look into was how Christmas affected the institution of slavery throughout the entire South. And I worked with a graduate student of mine, and we wrote an article that was published in the Journal of the Early Republic back in the 1980s. And I kept an interest after we published this article. I never did much more with it other than take a few notes here and there for a number of years. But when I got done with my book on filibustering, Manifest Destiny's Underworld, I was kind of musing over lunch one day, as I remember, with my wife, what am I going to do next? And she says, "You really ought to write that Christmas book." And I put that idea on the back burner for a while,
Mm,
but I finally got around to it after my retirement from teaching
mm,
and published Yuletide in Dixie, which is kind of an overview
mm,
of the entire Christmas experience for both whites and blacks in the South before the Civil War, and then how things evolved after the Civil War in Southern legend.
mm,
And so that was the a very broad book. My interest, of course, was what Christmas meant in the South, not only in terms of daily interactions between enslaved people and their owners, but also what it meant in terms of Black resistance and things like that, because I
mm,
found that the most the Christmas time was the time when Southern whites most feared slave rebellion, which makes sense for a million reasons, including the fact that uh, uh, the guard was down for white
mm,
people over the holidays because they're holding their own dances and
mm,
huge feasts and things like that, and Christmas tree present giving and all
mm,
this stuff. When blacks are pretty much on their own, they're not working and they could get together. And so they were afraid of rebellion. Anyway, that was the first book. And during that project, I kept running into this story of the Yule log and how
mm,
Christmas vacations were determined over Christmas time, supposedly by how a huge Yule log burned on the plantation every Christmas. And so I mentioned it for a paragraph or two in the Yuletide and Dixie book, but I was also very suspicious of it because
mm,
although all these legends grew after the Civil War about how the Yule log had determined the length of Christmas
mm,
holidays for Black people, I had never noticed pre-Civil War slaveholders or
mm,
runaway or escaped slaves when they published their narratives or autobiographies after they reached the North, like
mm,
Frederick Douglass. I never really noticed any allusions to
mm,
Yule logs, and
mm,
I took notes every time Christmas came up in anything. I took notes, so I had all the source material, and I'd never noticed anything.
mm,
And at the end of the project, just lingering in my mind again was this question: did it really happen?
mm,
Was there more of a story to be told? And so finally, a few years ago, I decided that I was going to investigate and really go methodically through the evidence and any new evidence I could pull up on Christmas in the antebellum South. And the idea was maybe there's a book there. Now, if I had started pulling up evidence immediately that they really burned Yule logs and the
mm,
Christmas vacations for slaves were determined by them, I would have dropped the project immediately. But I couldn't find any more evidence when I was looking for it. And I felt it was a very significant issue. We can get
mm,
into the significance, but I felt that this was worth a story because it was more than about the length a Yule log burned or
mm.
didn't burn.
Well, that leads me to two kind of related questions. First, I seem to remember following you on Facebook that you do go out on during Christmas period and go and look at the neighborhood sort of Christmas lights. So, how much of a
Yeah.
Christmas lover are you? Like, how much decoration goes on in the house?
Actually, not that much. We
No?
don't have to decorate.
Hmm.
The houses on our block are covered with Christmas decorations. And in fact, the guy who owns the house across the street from us, and it's almost gross how many decorations he has. And we have a big picture window on our
Mm,
kitchen room where we eat two of our meals every day. And we look out on all these decorations, and we all our exposures in the house, all our window exposures face north, and the street is on the north side, and
okay.
we see all these decorations. So although we may pull out a few My wife's father carved Santa Clauses, and we
Mm,
may pull out a few things like that at Christmas. We really don't go overboard anymore, and we have a cat, and we learned a long time ago that cats and Christmas tree decorations don't work well together.
mm,
And so we dispensed with that a number of years ago. So
mm.
no, we're not big into the decorations, but we do like the decorations.
Okay, good. Just curious, considering you did
Yeah.
write about Christmas there.
Yeah.
Now you already mentioned your Yuletide and Dixie book, and we before we started recording, you kind of mentioned the publisher's concern of two books having Yule in the titles there. And I'm kind of doing going to do the time machine thing. Would you have, if knowing that you would write a book about Yule logs, would you have named the first book differently in that case?
That's a great question. And the truth of the matter is, I simply can't think of a better title for a book about Christmas in the South that would get attention of
Hmm.
people than Yuletide and Dixie. I just
Hmm.
really can't. The term Dixie also brought, there's a lot of Confederate content. I have a whole
Hmm.
chapter in that book on Christmas and the Confederacy, and I just felt that Dixie, the Yuletide and Dixie did the right job. And ironically, when I started working on this second book,
Hmm.
and I started tracing where the legend developed
Hmm.
and how it developed, when it developed, I found an article published long after the Civil War, I think it was in the 20th century, that I hadn't been aware of when I did the first book that was actually titled Yuletide and Dixie. It was either in a newspaper or in a magazine, and I haven't used it for anything. It really didn't have anything that I needed.
Right.
Someone else had stumbled on the same title
Hmm.
and used it in something. I think back in the 1920s. I can't really read.
Wow. That's like it reminds me almost of it reminds me of a moment when I was in I think it was the year before we met when I was or no, it was the yeah, it was the semester before we met in Columbus for Schaefer. Um, I had a grad seminar, and one of the books I read was by our historian on campus, Richard Frankel, and it was called Hitler's Shadow. And I then discovered that there was a second book that also got called was called Hitler's Shadow that he didn't reference in his book.
Wow.
So that
Yeah,
was sort of like,
it,
huh,
it is. It,
interesting.
it is similar, and I've got to add as an appendix that I really felt that Yule had to be repeated in this second book's title, despite the publisher's concern that people would get them confused and not realize there was another book out there. I realized that was an issue. But the fact of the matter is that when people started writing about this tradition of not only burning the Yule log at Christmas to determine the vacation,
Mhm.
but also what the whole tradition was about, that the slaves would go out and soak that Yule log so that the holiday would last much longer. They tricked the master.
Mhm.
It's kind of putting on old massa, if you're familiar with that book title and that idea from long ago, Gilbert Osofsky's slave narratives that he edited. Um, but that if you consider the importance of it, the whole thing, that's what they're talking about. They're when they do the legend, they don't use any synonym for the log. They don't say the Christmas log burned. They say the Yule log burned. And of course, the term comes from all the European traditions, the Yule log and its connections to the winter solstice and the Epiphany and all that stuff. And uh, it's always referred to in European tradition as the Yule log. I mean, yeah, occasionally, the Brits will call it the Yule clog or the Christmas log. They have different terms, but 9 times out of 10, I don't know, 99% of the time, perhaps they use the term Yule log. So how can I write a book about the Yule log tradition when U.S. writers appropriate the
Mhm.
term Yule log and not. And I just argued with the publisher, no, you got to do this my way. I mean, for the one or two sales here and there that we're going to forfeit because people think it's the same book, it's what the book is about. It has to be.
Right. Um, we're already giving a lot away about the book, but I don't want to get into the book too much yet because the first thing I actually want to talk about is because obviously the first stage you do when you write a book is a research. But then there's also the kind of mental thinking about how do you best write the book? What's your audience and how do you reach that audience? So I wanted to I will say I had read can't remember I probably read five of your books by this point at least. Um, so I was very familiar with sort of your style of the way you write, the way you approach things. And I was very thrown off by the first page because it was so different in the way you wrote the book. So I'm not going to say more because I want to hear what you have to say, and then I'll explain sort of what
I
I saw.
appreciate where that's coming from, and I think I know where it's coming from, and I think you're referring to the sort of first person approach that I took here. And I was trained in grad school, and you
Mm,
probably were too, that historians are sober, and we only talk in the third person.
yes.
And that was drummed into me over and over again. I see some of this, by the way, in work by other scholars like Heather Cox Richardson recently, and her podcast, for instance, and how personalized a lot of it becomes. But to be honest, when I started writing, one of the thoughts was, what I'm trying to do, I have an interest in affecting the modern debate over the restoration of Confederate monuments
Mhm,
and the sanitizing of history that I think has become, yeah, I think it was really even more powerful at the state level in places
mhm,
like Florida for a while, and
mhm,
now the Trump administration has appropriated that. And we've got all these debates going on about whether we should make our history pleasant
mhm,
and so on. I didn't want to just speak to scholars with this book. I really wanted to reach the general public too.
mhm,
And as a result, I started thinking about how I could do this, how a topic that's really interesting,
mhm,
and these stories are very colorful, and
mhm,
you'll probably bring that up, but some of the quotes in the book are extremely funny and colorful.
mhm,
And I felt that this was a story that could really get to the public, raise serious questions in a
mhm,
way that would attract their attention. And so I thought about it, and I decided the first person approach
mhm,
made sense. And I also felt the detective
mhm,
story, or movie, or film, whatever you want to talk about, made sense. I've been very inspired by several works in my career over the course of my career that impelled me this way. I think the first one was a book I used over and over again when I was teaching the survey course in U.S. history. I think it's the greatest book to use in the survey course available. It's called After the Fact: The Art of Historical Detection by Andrew Little and James West Davidson. And I used to use that as the central text in my U.S. history course, even realizing what I sacrificed because it's not comprehensive. It's nothing like a real
mhm,
textbook, but it arouses his intellectual curiosity.
mhm,
And they approached problems through U.S. history chronologically, like the
mhm,
Declaration of Independence and the Salem witch trials and things like that. But they always approached it from the idea of what are we, how do we find out the story? How do we find out the truth about the
mhm,
story? How do we determine what this story really tells us and
mhm,
why it's significant? And I just found that work so exciting. So that was one. And then later on, I read W. Boynton Merrill's book, Jefferson's Nephews, which is a book that most people really aren't familiar with, but it was the discovery of a couple of, I think it was skulls from enslaved people that had been killed by Jefferson's nephews.
Mm,
And the skulls were discovered when the chimney of a house collapsed, and in the rubble they were discovered, and there become all sorts of it really was a murder case, and Hal Boynton Merrill tracked this down, explained it all to his reading audience. I
mm,
love that book, and
right.
that was my second model. And then more recently, Steel Driving Man about the legend of John Henry
Mm,
by Nelson. And that book also got me. Was there really a John Henry? And
mm,
where was he buried? And was he really involved in a railroad tunnel and all that kind of stuff? So that was my inspiration beyond any
mm,
doubt. And what I decided to do was to go chronologically
mm,
and take the reader along with me
mm,
and all the winding in and outs, because I've got to say there were times when I almost dropped the project. I would run into a piece of evidence and I would say, oh, I might be wrong. Maybe this really was a thing. Maybe all slaves really did get their Christmas
mm,
holidays through Yule log
mm,
burns. And I would run into a document and it would just really throw me for a loop, and I would almost throw in the towel. But I
mm,
kept plugging along to find out the truth about those documents. And in the end, I determined that my suspicions initially were absolutely right,
mm,
and that this did deserve a book, and it did deserve it. It's a warning sign. It's a red flag, I think, to
mm,
people to not buy into the Southern plantation legend that life was wonderful in the Old South and that planters and slaves had mutual respect and affection for each other, and
mm,
that Christmas was the ultimate expression of all this affection and the organic functioning of this society, that everything was
mm,
mutually harmonious, and so a lot of BS, to put it
mm,
bluntly, and that this story absolutely had to be told. But did I have doubts along the way? Yes, yes, I did, but I'm absolutely convinced that the story needed to be told now, and I've got to add to that something I mentioned in the preface to the book. But the whole uproar over slave quilts a few years ago was one of the things that inspired me, and I think my book correlates with that. That a woman came along, I think it was a female historian, but there was a whole thing a few years ago that the Underground Railroad was in many ways revolved around these quilts
mm,
that were hung out for slaves to see on the line, so that when they ran away, they could read these maps on these quilts and figure out by certain hints and symbols on the quilts where the nearest safe house was and all that. And I think that's been pretty much discredited. And
mm,
so I think it's very easy to buy into inspiration stories. I
mm,
would put these all under the category of inspiration stories that you can overcome adversity.
mm,
And yeah, I think inspiration stories are wonderful and we need them. But our job as historians is to read why these stories exist and whether they, in fact, have any basis in truth.
mm.
And that was what got me going.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed it as much as it was initially like, what's Bob on? Moments there that I kind of really enjoyed the way you approached the writing of the book. It made the book so much nicer flowing and sort of you kind of wanted to follow along. It was a bit of a page turner in that you kind of were like, okay, where does this now lead? What's the next step in this search? And you kind of were like of course I had sort of already in my mind like very early on like yeah this gotta be a miss that it can't be right that they had made this up but it was sort of nice to see you how you kind of struggled with it and how you eventually kind of were getting to like, yeah, it just look at the evidence. It just doesn't square up.
Yeah, and let me add on that the problem isn't the myth itself, but it's how it's been propagated and
Hmm.
duplicated and reinforced over time, so that
Hmm.
it's in all these kinds of different sources that
Hmm.
you accept as ultimate truth. For instance, the Charles Reagan Wilson's, I think it's 24 volume New Encyclopedia of Southern Culture, actually has the same article in two different volumes about Christmas and the South. And in this article, it gives the whole Yule log myth, and it's not so much that historians and others suggested that some slaves, most historians are cautious, and they say a few slaves might have, had Christmas holidays by this
Hmm.
practice. But in fact, many works, both fiction and nonfiction, give the impression that literally every
Hmm.
slave on every plantation
Hmm.
in the South got their Christmas holiday, and that it was a long one, and that
Hmm.
it was determined by the Yule log. It might go on a week, it might go on 2 weeks. I've even seen allusions to a month or more. If you can imagine one log that fits in a fireplace burning for a month or more. But I've seen that. And
Hmm.
so it turns up in encyclopedias of Christmas.
Hmm.
It's in the New Encyclopedia of Southern Culture. It's in all sorts of encyclopedias of Black holidays and
Hmm.
things like that. And not just encyclopedias, some serious history monographs have it. And it's been in children's books.
Hmm.
It's been in holiday cookbooks. It's been in pop magazines where you wouldn't
Hmm.
expect it, like Outdoors in Georgia
Hmm.
reprinted it, and North Carolina roadways. And I found it in a Christmas season issue of a U.S. Army strategic magazine,
Hmm.
and strategic studies. And I found it in what probably the best-selling young adult book on Christmas that's come out maybe ever, that it won one of them. I think it was the Newbery Prize. It's been just widely heralded and praised because of its realistic
Hmm.
approach to Christmas. And I'm talking about uh, Patricia and Frederick McKissick's book, Christmas in the Big House, Christmas in the Quarters. And it talks about it. So you realize it's been really
Hmm.
insinuated itself into our popular culture, and that readers of this myth, as well as at Plantation tourist sites, and they're given the impression that literally every slave had a long holiday, and that it was determined by this very cute um, practice in the South of soaking and then burning the Yule log and so on. And I think
Hmm.
that's just insidious and very, very misleading, and it seriously needed correction.
Well, now you can write a lot of letters to all the places that need to change.
And I have, and that's one of the most interesting things.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
I
Well, let's
did,
go
I
there.
actually, that some of this is in the footnotes, but I should mention this. That when I found someone, a historian
Hmm.
or a tour guide or a reenactor
Hmm.
or a publicist for a historic site, and we can get into some of these later, but they include Colonial Williamsburg, which is very reputable. Uh, when they came up, I would write the historian, and I'd basically say, I'm very interested. I've been studying this topic, and I was just
Hmm.
wondering, do you have any documents to support your evidence
Hmm.
or your assertions?
Right.
your ceremonies that you put on at the historic
Hmm.
places. And most of the historic places, if I wrote the institutions directly, did respond.
Okay.
Very few of the reenactors responded.
Mm.
The few times when I got responses, they would be things like, well, we don't really have documentary evidence for this, but we suspect it. We suspect it. And It really was remarkable how many people simply ignored my emails because I think I
Hmm.
had them at the rights. I never had a single person send me a diary
Mm.
or a letter from pre-emancipation times, whether we're talking about a colonial time
Mm.
claim that somewhere in Maryland or Virginia, colonial Virginia, they burned Yule logs and the slaves got long holidays from.
Mm.
I never got a single letter or
Mm.
diary citation. I never even got a newspaper. There were no newspaper claims, as far as I know, in the colonial period that this went
Mm.
on. And even later,
Mm.
so that no, there were no rebuttals. The book's been out a year. I have yet to get a rebuttal, which gives me documentary evidence. And I've got to emphasize that what I'm trying to say in the book is not that the story wasn't around before the Civil War. As I point out in the book, I was able to find three very small pieces of evidence,
Mm.
all of them secondary, none of them eyewitness,
Mm.
that claim this practice occurred during the Civil War. I think it's, first of all, very significant
Mm.
that the earliest one of these was only 18 years before emancipation. So you're dealing with what, over 200 years
Mm.
of slavery, uh, with no documentary evidence at all, no eyewitness account at all. And then you're dealing with, suddenly you have only three pieces of evidence between the Mexican War and emancipation. Only three
Mm.
pieces of evidence. And one of those is in a novel written by an Englishman, an English immigrant to America. So, very thin
Mm.
evidentiary base for all this.
Mm.
So they've got a lot to rebut with. All they have to
Mm.
do is come up with something that Thomas Jefferson said in his voluminous correspondence
Mm.
about the Yule log burning at at one of his mansions, and uh, that'll it could still happen. And I say that in the final chapter of the book. I
Mm.
realize that, but even if someone were to come up with a rebuttal and said, "Oh, here's an actual plantation mistress who's writing on
Mm.
December 24th, 1832, that tonight is Christmas Eve, and
Mm.
the our people, which was the term they often used for the field slaves, our people or the Negroes or whatever they'd call them, will be bringing in the Yule log. That could still happen, and I basically admit it could happen. But I think even if that happened, I would argue that the odds of more than a fraction of 1% of all Southern slaves
Mm.
getting their Christmas holidays determined by Yule logs is highly unlikely. I'd stake all my money on
You're a historian. You don't have that much.
it.
But you opened the door to Williamsburg, so I'm going to step into that door and kind of press you a little bit more on it because when I turned my U.S. history survey into a sort of public history, memory-based approach and kind of looked at how we remember the past, I included Williamsburg because I thought it was such a fascinating place for students to kind of play with and kind of learn about how contemporary assumptions influence the presentation of history. And I always loved it was, hate to say it, uh, but on their on the Wikipedia page of Colonial Williamsburg, the then president in March 2016, Mitchell Rice, is quoted as having said that Colonial Williamsburg presents history accurate-ish. So it sounds like you are agreeing with that sort of assessment of Colonial Williamsburg when it comes to Christmas.
Well, it's one of the more interesting sources, cases, but there are many others like Redcliffe, the Hammond home in
Mm,
on Beach Island in South Carolina. There were a number of cases like this that are extremely interesting, and I think probably Colonial Williamsburg in many ways is the most problematic and the most interesting,
mm,
because what they have done since 1940 is they have a Yule log ceremony. And without stating that the slaves always got their Christmas holidays by this Yule log ceremony, without stating that that's dogmatically,
mm,
they give that impression because you've got blacks in livery bringing the Yule. They've got a big photo of it that they had on their website for a long time. I don't know if it's still there, but I think it
mm,
was there as late as 2021, carrying in this huge log.
mm,
Uh, and so they every year they had a Yule log ceremony. And the fact is, I found very few allusions even to the term Yule in
mm,
colonial America. Uh, I did, it just wasn't used very much. Now, when
mm,
William Gilmore Simms wrote about colonial times in
mm,
Virginia, he mentioned a Yule log, and he's very unusual. I don't even think many planters and their wives in antebellum Alabama, let's say, used the term
mm,
Yule in any way, not just
right,
Yule log, but just the Yule is coming. I don't think it was a common term. I don't think it
mm,
was a common term in colonial America. I don't think they, supposedly, according to the English tradition, the Yule log was a big deal. You brought it into the mansion with singing and instruments playing. You
mm,
sprinkled it with, it varies, but some people say wine or other spirits,
mm,
uh, herbs. It was supposed to bring good luck. There were all sorts of superstitions
mm,
connected with Yule log, and they'd say prayers over it, and it was a really big deal. I have yet to see evidentiary uh, proof that this occurred
mm,
anywhere in America, in the writ, and
mm,
you'd expect it mostly in the wealthy homes, of course,
mm,
but they wrote the most letters and diaries, and
mm,
uh, but even in the literature about colonial America, even in the novels, even in the um, the newspapers, the
right,
colonial newspapers. I just don't think they use the term Yule log at all. And
mm,
I don't believe that it really came to
mm,
colonial America. And I love the book about colonial Maryland that I ran into. There was this book about colonial Maryland, which described colonial mansions, at least,
mm,
maybe not middle class homes, but the mansions uh, of the plantations as
mm,
having immense fireplaces, which of course would
mm,
hold a Yule log, and they'd be big enough for one. And they describe the fireplaces enormous, and then they say one can just picture the Yule logs being carried in. Now, this is a book
mm,
written in, I think, the 20th century about colonial Maryland. So it gives the impression that every mansion
right,
had a Yule log and that they burned a Yule log.
mm,
And that it may say something like they must have been there.
mm,
But there's no proof. If they had one big log that they designated the Yule
mm,
log, there's no proof of it. There's
mm,
no proof that it had anything to do with how long Christmas was celebrated.
mm,
So then you get back to colonial Williamsburg,
mm,
knowing all this, knowing they
mm,
didn't use the term. And yet, colonial Williamsburg, which is supposed to be an accurate reflection of colonial times, is using the term Yule log over and over again, year after year, in its publicity.
mm,
And so I did write Colonial Williamsburg, and they were very nice. And they basically admitted they didn't have a shred of evidence that a Yule log, much less that it determined the slave holiday, that a Yule log was burned in Virginia, in colonial Virginia. But they did post that at least 1 year on their site. There is a disclaimer. So on the one hand, you've got a visual
mm,
projection of the Yule log being brought
mm,
into the mansion by sturdy black people.
mm,
And on the other hand, you have a disavowal that Yule logs even existed as such in colonial Virginia, which is absolutely hilarious. So I found this no no site really could come up with
mm,
proof, and yet a number of them, as I
mm,
point out in the book, do give the impression that that's how enslaved people in the South got their
mm.
holidays.
And when as I was reading those sections, because I like we were both interested in sort of the aspects of the misinterpretation and mispresentation of slavery in and on Southern plantations, plantation homes, plantation museums. Um, I did much less publishing on that. I did take more students to tours to kind of see the ignorance with regard to, or the silences, I guess would be the best term of enslaved people. It so speaks to exactly the continued problem of the silencing of the African American, the enslaved voice, that we're just making up a story that makes the plantation seem nice.
Yeah, one site manager in the South, they was quoted in the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, and the site manager, I think, well, I may be conflating two places, but one of the site managers actually said in explaining how they had this Yule log and the slaves all
Mhm,
got their holidays, they soaked it, and so on and so forth. On the one hand, he said their holiday was determined by the Yule log and how
mhm,
long it burned. And then in the same interview, he says the slaves got 4 days for Christmas.
mhm.
Well, there's just an inherent dissonance there. There's something kooky. I mean, if the Yule log can burn anywhere from let's say a night to a week,
Right.
and it varies depending on how well soaked the log is and how
Mhm,
green the log is. And there are all these factors that go into how long a Yule log might burn. And yet it's preset at 4 days. I mean, it's one or the other, but it's not both. And he didn't notice the contradiction, and he said
mhm,
it in the same interview. So, yeah, I think there's a real problem, and I think the whole thing is glossing over the truth
mhm,
about Christmas. Now, I do get into this in my last chapter of the book where I talk about how when the term log comes up in the context of the Old South, and then I go into the real history of what happened on Christmas. And if you read accounts, and a real good example of this is Benjamin Drew's collection. Benjamin Drew was a Boston abolitionist, went up into Canada West, today's Ontario, and he interviewed, I think it's something like 122 slaves to find out what slavery had been like in the South before they ran away. They were fugitives living in Canada. And so you have all these interviews, and they didn't really talk a lot about Christmas. Unlike many of the escaped people who stayed in the US, like Frederick Douglass,
mhm,
who did talk about Christmas. The ones in Canada didn't talk a lot about the holiday and how wonderful
mhm,
it was, but they did use the term log.
mhm,
But it wasn't the Yule log that gave them a wonderful, marvelous holiday. The Yule log was where the master took you to punish you. And they didn't use the term Yule. They just said the log at Christmas.
mhm,
I was taken by master who was angry at me, and he made me strip to the waist and made me lie across this big log and
mm,
whipped me over it. And we forget the other side of
mm,
Christmas, which was what my first book was really about, Yuletide in Dixie. When I talked about, I had a whole chapter about punishment at
mm,
Christmas time. So, yeah, they get gifts, but a lot of them are still whipped,
mm,
punished in other ways. They're deprived. Some of them aren't given Christmas feasts.
mm,
They're deprived of food as a means of punishment. They're sold at Christmas.
mm,
They're marched overland to new.
mm,
And one of the people in Edward Baptist in his book the half that's never been told or whatever, uh, the that they're marched overland at Christmas time and
mm,
that kind of thing. They're given away as Christmas presents. There were
mm,
actual ceremonies in some wealthy households where the mistress or the master of the plantation actually gave a slave away to another family member as a Christmas present. And they use that term in
mm,
their own writings, whether it's a letter or an autobiography or a diary or what have you. They actually say that we
mm,
gave Johnny away as a present to Mary or to whoever, and so I think this is all a distraction. When you make the
mm,
Christmas holiday, it's not that it wasn't joyous for some slaves. Maybe many slaves would even be. I'm willing to concede that many slaves, they're not working for the only time, for one of the few times in the year. Yes, they get Sundays off on most places, but it was a time off from work. And yes, they often got more than one day. If anyone's curious who's watching this, my guess is that the average Christmas holiday was 3 to 4 days.
mm,
And we have documentary evidence. We just don't have a statistical
mm,
uh, layout on how many got a 3 to 4 day uh, vacation. But that's my impression. They got the typical, if you want to use the word typical, if there is such a thing, and I think every
mm,
individual enslaved person had an experience profound to themselves. Um, but I think they got days off. Most of them got presents of some sort, although, as I point out in my book, the clothing they were getting and the extra food supplies, you might say, were given for the purposes so that they wouldn't get sick.
yes,
They'd stay warm enough over the winter, and so they could do labor.
mm,
And they could labor harder because you need a certain amount of calories to labor. And so these presents, many of them were in the master's self-interest, but not the toys. They spent some extra money. So yeah, I'm willing to concede all that. The
mm,
typical enslaved person in the South probably had a fairly merry, happy time. They may have had dances. It was one of the few times in the year when they could court each other comfortably.
mm,
Uh, they'd meet people from other plantations because often the barbecues that the masters threw were open to anyone from a nearby plantation. They were pleasant times for a
mm,
large number, maybe a majority.
mm,
Uh, but these stories totally hide the horror of
mm,
enslavement, the fact that they were horrific
mm,
for many black people, that no black person would have traded their freedom had they had that choice for a few Christmas presents from their
mm,
master or mistress. And no white people would have looked
mm,
at their enslaved people's experiences and said, oh my God, they're having so much fun with those Yule logs and those Christmas gifts that I wish we were slaves. We wouldn't have all these cares, you know. But that's what they said after the Civil War in their propaganda. When they write their memoirs,
mm,
some of them say, oh, the slaves were such a burden financially and time-wise on Papa and Mama. Our parents just struggled so hard because they had all these blacks in the field and blacks and those blacks in the The servants didn't always do their
mm,
job well, and they were such a pain in the neck. And
mm,
uh, they say this in their propaganda. They say many of them would have rather have been the slaves themselves. The slaves had it better. Yeah,
mm,
but that's not really what happened. That's not real. That's the biggest fantasy of all, maybe.
mm,
That's what we really lose sight of, just how horrific it is
mm,
to have very little control over your own future, your own will. I mean, you may have they can't control your thoughts, but they can control your lives. And how horrific that is, not to mention the physical punishment of working in rice swamps or,
mm,
the sugar cane fields or, some of the absolutely
mm,
unbelievable working conditions, working hours that most slaves had all year long to get that Christmas holiday, which was sort of like an escape valve, a safety valve, like a steam pot. You've got to let some
mm,
of the pressure off, or you're going to have a black rebellion on your hands. So a
mm.
lot of this is in the master's ultimate long-term interest.
Yeah. Well, we are drifting towards the sort of lost cause influence on, but before we get there, I did want briefly to also ask this because you you did a lot of like you did some footwork for like the historical sources. So you went to like the colonial documents, you looked through the kind of antebellum newspapers, antebellum diaries, but you also have a lot of plantations that are in modern times hosting these Yule log events or individuals dressing up in like period clothes, giving Christmas tours. And I kind of was curious, where did you find some of that information? Did you go to their websites and found it or like social
I went
media?
everywhere I could, and I should give credit to Brandon Bird, who wrote an article on Christmas tours in the Old South, which
Hmm.
I mean, at these mansions, which was useful to me when I wrote my first book. Uh, but to find the stuff on the Yule log, which I don't think he mentions, um, yes, okay. So I go to the websites, I
Hmm.
write the sites.
Hmm.
I newspaper sources told me which sites especially to contact
Hmm.
because newspapers covered the programming at
Hmm.
these various sites. And before we're done, we need to talk a little bit about Westville in
Yes.
Georgia.
Yes.
But newspapers would alert me to Yule log programs and Google searches. Um, Tourist magazines,
Hmm.
you go to Google and you look up a place like, well, John Quitman's
Hmm.
mansion. I wrote my first book on Monmouth. There was at one point. I don't think they do a special Christmas program anymore, but at one point they were doing special Christmas programs every year. If you did a Google search and you just wrote down, you put in Monmouth Christmas, you get all sorts of stuff about their Christmas programming. And you can do that. So I would, at one point, I took out a list
Hmm.
of all the major tourist sites for each state because they have been published and there have been books. The
Hmm.
Hortons have done a lot on southern plantation sites. And
Hmm.
you can look up the names of them first. That's your starting point. Then you go to Google
Hmm.
and you try to find out what their programming is.
Hmm.
And you use code words
Hmm.
like the best code term to get at this stuff is candlelight tour because they do candlelight tours at Christmas. So you learn what are the
Hmm.
words you should plug in because not everything will come up under
Hmm.
every term search. So you have to be imaginative and
Hmm.
and think about it a lot. But I did a lot of Googling. I did a lot of newspaper stuff. I went to every newspaper digital source I could find and do those same kind of word searches because although some of them don't go up to modern times, like I think doesn't Chronicling America stop somewhere around 1912 or something like that? I don't
So it
think
was
it goes
50s, but yeah.
to get up to the 50s. Well, it
Hmm.
certainly doesn't get past the 50s, and most Southern tours are in the
Hmm.
post-civil rights era. That is to say, before air conditioning, before the civil rights movement,
Mm,
there wasn't nearly as much touring of southern plantations, although the Natchez pilgrimage goes back much further. But most of this stuff started late. And so you find your best stuff if you can find digital sources that cover the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, when most of
mm,
these tours cranked up. Some of the tours have been taken down or
mm,
basically deconstructed since there were a lot of protests of these
mm,
tours around 2010 and after, as we became very conscious of Confederate
mm,
memory. And so there aren't as many of them today.
mm,
But yeah, I tried to find
mm,
literally every one I could, and then I tried to get into their programming. Red Cliff in South Carolina, the Governor Hammond's home, um, was amazingly helpful. They even sent the texts that their reenactors and tour guides used when people visited
mm,
the site. So I could see exactly what was used there. And
mm,
some of them were very cooperative that way and extremely helpful. And I've got to say that I loved corresponding with Mount Vernon. They were very helpful too.
mm.
Yeah.
Oh. As much as I want to like go for Mount Vernon now, I'm not going to go to it because you mentioned the other ones that we should talk about, the Westville Village Yule log story, which
Yeah.
and this is sort of like it immediately was a head scratcher for me because the Library of Congress classified it as authentic, had an authentication
Yes.
done, which is like, what does that even mean?
Yes, this is just a wonderful story. Well, okay, we've all been to living history sites.
Mm,
Or most people have. You may have toured Colonial Williamsburg, which is a living history site. A living history site is where you have reenactors in costumes appropriate to the eras they're enacting, and um, that put on programming and so on. So
mm,
Colonial Williamsburg is that kind of a living history site.
mm,
And in Indiana, where I taught my entire collegiate teaching career, they had Connor Prairie. And so the South has quite a few of these. And one of them I had never heard of before I got into this project, but it was this Westville Village in southwestern Georgia, and it no longer exists as a living history site, but in its time, thousands and thousands of school children toured it on
mm,
trips. So it influenced
mm,
and normal tourists. It influenced a lot of people, and they got the programming there. It started, I think, in 1940. It lasted until I think about 2012 or so. And during that period, around 1974, they started a Yule log ceremony every
mm,
year. And this involved all sorts of things. I think they had tourists help bring in the Yule log, and they had a whole program built around it, and occasionally got news coverage. So in one of the interviews, for instance, one of their staff explained, I think that was the case of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, explained um, what this was based on, and gave very serious explanation of how the slaves would go out and soak their Yule log for an extended period of time and carry it into the mansion and so on and so forth, and they'd get Christmas as long as the log lasted. And this program went on, and the year 2000 rolls around. Well, the Library of Congress was 200 years old. I mean, President
mm,
Jefferson had a major role in establishing the Library of Congress, right? And it's 200 years old in the year 2000.
mm,
And they decided to create what's called the Local Legacies Project.
mm,
And what the Library of Congress did was it invited people to nominate local programs. Now, it could be a site itself, it
mm,
could be an event like a rodeo, an annual
mm,
rodeo. It could be almost anything that was particular and special about a site that other sites didn't have.
mm,
And they could nominate it to be recognized as a Library of Congress local legacy project. And they actually wanted every congressman to
mm,
nominate a minimum of one site. So, of course, the
mm,
congressman either would know of one himself or herself, or would uh, contact newspapers or people in the district and
mm,
say, who would you like to nominate
mm,
for your local legacies project? So the nomination
mm,
would get pushed up to the congressman. It was the congressman who or person who made the formal nomination, and then it had to be authenticated or approved by the Library of Congress.
mm,
And there are files of it, and it was announced publicly, and there are lists of local. So they didn't nominate Westville for the local legacies project. They nominated the Westville Yule log program as Georgia's local legacy project. Now there may have been others. There probably were many others from Georgia, but for that district,
mm,
that was the local legacies project. And so I then wrote the Library of Congress to find out the authentication project. What had to be submitted with a file? Well, what was submitted were photographs of the ceremony each year at
mm,
Westville Village, and descriptions of it by people and think what the reenactors did.
mm,
That's what it was. It was very factual. It was what went on.
mm,
You happened to drop by as a tourist for to
mm,
see their Yule log ceremony each year.
mm,
But not a single document had to be sent authenticating that there ever was a Yule log burned in that district or even in the whole state of Georgia.
mm,
Any point, it was supposedly during antebellum times, but not even during the colonial period. I mean, at any point in Southern history when slavery existed, not a single document had to be submitted. And I found a similar thing when I was dealing with the colonial period, and I found a book that claimed that black families in New London County, Connecticut,
mm,
this was a book written in the 1980s, that this black family was given a Christmas according to the Yule log that was brought into the
mm,
master's household and so on and so forth. And I tried to track that down, and I wrote the New
mm,
London County Historical Society, and I said, how did this story come about? How was it
mm.
promoted in this book? Because the authors of the book, 1988, they were both dead,
Right. Yeah.
and they didn't know. So, and that was after I checked it was a co-authored book, and I checked their footnotes,
Mm,
and yeah, they had a footnote for the Yule log being burned in Connecticut during slave times before Connecticut abolished slavery. And I checked the footnote out, and they cited a book written in the 1920s. So
mm,
then I went to the book written in the 1920s, and yeah. Anyway, to make a long story short, the book in the 1920s had no document cited for it.
mm,
So I went the extra step. I wrote everyone I could think of in that area of Connecticut, in the city, in the town, and just about everyone I could think of, who the local historical experts that were
mm,
widely known, and so on and so forth, local historians, the County Historical Society, and no one could
mm,
authenticate it at all. They just said the whole story must have been based on a suspicion that the thing occurred, which led me to my conclusion that, in fact, what had happened was the authors of the 1988 or the 1920s book
mm,
read some account written by someone well after the Civil War
mm.
and decided, oh, it must be a real thing.
Right.
So, yeah.
I love the footwork you did with this and the way the detective story that comes out again and again of like how well, I found this, so I have to go back to this footnote and figure out, and oh, they didn't do anything of citation wise, and it's just,
Right,
yeah.
exactly.
So I already mentioned the lost cause here, and it felt, and I think you only had a few little mentions of it, but it felt very much that this Yule log story sort of to tell like the plantation is this nice place at Christmas, that it's a quote unquote happy place at Christmas, builds on, feeds into, supports this lost cause ideology that emerges after the Civil War of kind of dismissing the horrors of slavery.
Exactly. And the longest chapter in the book is about the lost cause and the Yule log
Hmm,
myth. And uh, what I discovered was that I wouldn't even say after the Civil War, it really starts after Reconstruction.
hmm,
And the very first iteration that's significant, I think, of the lost cause myth is done Christmas time 1877, which most of your viewers
hmm,
are going to know that that's the first Christmas after Reconstruction.
hmm,
And I don't think it's any coincidence. So
hmm,
this native Virginian poet named Innes Randolph uh, writes this book that's subtitled, I think, or writes this poem. I think it's called the Yule Log, but the subtitle is the key. It's Uncle Ned's Big Laugh.
hmm,
Uncle in Plantation uh, rhetoric and speech and so on is always it's an elderly black man, black slave, and just like Auntie, they didn't address their black workers by normal forms of address. They were always demeaning terms, put downs like Uncle and Auntie and things like that. And so Uncle Ned is a slave. And the poem's about him and how he soaks, he's an elderly slave. He soaks the Yule log at Christmas and brings it into the mansion and it burns forever.
hmm,
And he's having a great time while he does it, but he doesn't want the master to know that he's being conned. So he goes behind the cabin or the house or wherever he is and he laughs his heart out. This is all in the poem because he's fooled the master.
hmm,
And uh, and then he finally Christmas is about over and the log breaks in two, and that was supposedly, according to the legend, when it all came to an end.
hmm,
The log broke in two. The master would declare Christmas at an end, and you go back to work the next day. That's
hmm,
supposedly the way it worked. And the log breaks in two, and the master's just furious, and he's really curious at how he gets tricked. I mean,
hmm,
how did that log last so long? So he gets Ned drunk, and then he confronts Ned, and in a much more compliant mood, Ned responds when the master says, "So how'd you get the log to burn so long?" And Ned basically spills the beans. He basically says, "We soaked it for weeks or whatever," and
hmm,
and so on. And it's all very pleasant. If at
hmm,
this point in the poem the master had whipped Ned,
hmm,
it wouldn't leave a good taste in your mouth.
hmm,
But basically, you get the impression, and in most of these stories, blacks are never whipped for fooling their master, which in real life, I
hmm,
don't think would have been the
hmm,
case. But the master, in some cases, the master knows all along and he's in on
hmm,
the con, which makes him a nice guy.
hmm,
He's letting them think they've fooled him so they get some satisfaction during the Christmas season.
hmm,
No harm's done to the master. He would have given them the holiday anyway.
hmm,
Other times they discover it, but oftentimes they laugh and they let the slaves go back to their cabin
hmm,
and all's hunky dory. Everything's fine. And this was a clue to me that this is a lost cause. So I started,
hmm,
to make slavery look good. The masters and the slaves get along. It's a very well functioning society, the plantation, that is. And so I started looking at Inns Randolph. I wanted to know more about Inns Randolph because I found that this poem was republished. It
Mm,
was used for orations
mm,
by people when they had to give, orations. They loved this poem and they gave
mm,
it. And it was in books,
mm,
collected oration topics and things like that.
mm,
Uh, so it spread and it was republished year after year.
mm,
So I wanted to know more about Inns Randolph, and I found out that he had served as an engineer under Richard Ewell and
mm,
in Virginia throughout almost the entire Civil War, and he's kind of known for his map making. And
mm,
uh, you can find him in cartographical collections. And
mm,
um, anyway, that put me on to things. And he also wrote a famous poem about a bitter ex-Confederate, and so on and so forth. And so that made me wonder, maybe this is all part of the lost cause propaganda. So then I looked at the other key figures. Now, one of them, I basically found five or six that really got the word out. Like one of them published in Ladies' Home Journal and Harper's Bazaar, magazines like that. Um, One of them I couldn't track down. There was a Yule log story that was told in the Youth's Companion, which was a Boston publication aimed mostly at young people that adults read also. It was very widely circulated. And I couldn't find because it was published anonymously, and I still don't know. If anyone knows, I'd love to know. Just let me know who published the Yule log story in Youth's Companion. Could have been a Southerner, could have been a Northerner, because many Northerners bought in to the lost cause and recirculated it. Just like today, there are plenty of people in the northern states who support the idea of restoring Confederate monuments, like the Albert Pike Monument in Washington, D.C., and all the monuments that are being restored. So, but then all the others were white Southerners, and all of them came from families that owned slaves at least at one time. And I found that they had incredible Confederate connections, that almost all of them, many of the women were involved with the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And this was especially the case. The three key figures that come after Inns Randolph are the Cameron sisters of North Carolina, Anna and Sarah Rebecca, and then a woman who published just after the turn of the century, LaSalle Pickett. And both the Cameron sisters were involved with lost cause stuff. They were involved in getting monuments raised in the late 19th century to Confederate heroes like Randolph Shotwell, who was a Virginian who was captured by Union forces, imprisoned, and then got involved or was accused of involvement with the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction. He was imprisoned again. And one of the Cameron girls or women was involved and they were very young when they first got involved in this stuff, got involved in the monument cause.
mm,
And Then there was a monument that went up to the Confederacy itself, to the Confederate soldiers in Raleigh. And the people advocating it included the Cameron sisters. And one of the Cameron, I think Anna Cameron said that she considered the Confederate soldier the bravest hero of all human history. I mean, that was the kind of feeling she had. And she seemed to have kind of what we would call, quote, paternalistic attitudes toward blacks.
mm,
Though she said in one Civil War letter when she was growing up that she wished the family could buy back their slaves. They had had to sell their slaves because they were having economic trouble. And she said, I wish we could buy them back. And this is a year or two before the end of slavery. Um, but Sarah Rebecca is a different story. She seems to really hate black people.
mm,
And she really resents the fact that blacks in North Carolina still, in some places, most particularly on the coast where you have a heavy black population, in Wilmington, the blacks can still hold office and they can still vote. And they've got a black newspaper there and so on and so forth. And she really is angry about this. So she writes her cousin, Alfred Waddell, and she says, who's an ex-Confederate, and she writes Waddell and she says, I've been speaking to the women around here, and basically, we feel that if you don't do something about this, and we really think you ought to solve this whole problem with shotguns. She says, if you can't solve this, you might as well use those shotguns on us white women of the South. And it's basically that old rape phobia. It's implicit in the whole thing.
Mm.
If you let blacks have power, if you continue to be emasculated,
Right.
she's really saying, then you might as well shoot us. And she says, this is the time. And she even lays out the idea that once you get
Mm.
rid of these people, and their power, then it's time to revise North Carolina's constitution. They were one of the later states, to get into all this, long after the Mississippi grandfather clause and so on. And let's revise the Constitution, make sure we just constitutionally outlaw black voting and office holding. So this is the kind of woman she is. And
Mm.
shortly after she writes Waddell, he becomes the leader of the Wilmington race riot, one of the most
Mm.
famous race riots in all of American history, that
Mm.
totally ends black political power,
Yeah.
really in the whole state, but certainly in Wilmington, for decades.
Mm.
And I haven't found the evidence yet where he says he was inspired by the words of a woman who promoted the Yule log myth, but I suspect it played a role
Mm.
in all that. So, and this continues. There are actually more people promoting the Yule log in the 20th century, including an
Mm.
Indianapolis journalist who
Mm.
had Southern roots. There are more of them in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, I'd say between
Mm.
1900 and about the 1950s,
Yeah.
than there were in the late 19th century. But these people are much less famous.
Mm.
LaSalle Pickett was the wife of General George Pickett of Pickett's
Mm.
Charge at Gettysburg. And she spent her whole adult life promoting the Confederacy. She spoke at Chautauquas. She was one of the most famous public speakers in
Mm.
all of America for a while in the late 19th century, early 20, maybe the speaking started in the early 20th, but she was one of the most famous public speakers of the era. And so she was well known. The Cameron sisters published a lot of magazine articles. They were well known. Inns Randolph was kind of well known. But the ones in the 20th century are names that I had never heard before, and I don't think most people have ever heard before. And the Yule log stories appeared in little newspaper articles, magazine articles all over. People with names like Mary Alice Blackmore. If anyone is watching this and has ever heard of Alice Blackmore, I'd be a little bit surprised. But she wrote one of these Yule log stories, and and I would say the overwhelming percentage of them were Southern white
Mm.
women,
Mm.
and the overwhelming percentage of those Southern white women were connected in one way or another with the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And even LaSalle Pickett, who I
Mm.
don't think anyone's ever proved that she was an actual member, but she did speak, I think, at least once or twice to UDC meetings and had a connection with them. So there's a real, if the United Daughters of the Confederacy is kind of our epitome of what the Lost Cause was,
Mm.
uh, then I think the Yule log story
Mm.
itself is actually at the heart of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And I am surprised by the fact that most historians of the Lost Cause give very little attention, not just to the Yule
Mm.
log story, but to Christmas itself, because
Mm.
there's a strong Christmas component of
Mm.
the Lost Cause. Many books that are
Mm.
written in the Lost Cause tradition have whole chapters
Mm.
devoted to Christmas, and very few very little of the historiography of the Lost
Mhm.
Cause focuses on how important Christmas was to that whole ideology.
Wow, I feel personally attacked because I called I think I said in the book when we wrote, Duncan and I wrote it, that there's sort of a dead horse that we're beating with the lost cause these days, but you just said like, nope, we have still a lot to cover.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm still learning. I mean, stuff comes out, I still
yeah.
learn.
Yeah, but you kind of covered like I think 5 or 6 different talking points that I had in mind for, and you covered all of them in just one stretch of like the LaSalle and Camerons and the UDC.
Historians have this terrible verbosity, don't we, sometimes? But if you want me to elaborate on anything in there, sure. Otherwise, we're
No,
going to
I
move.
think the only thing I think that was really interesting about the Cameron sisters and Pickett was how, and correct me if I misread this, but it seemed like they were quintessential in nationalizing and promoting and kind of creating that Yule log myth that we still have with us.
Exactly. I mean, Pickett's a great example. She is actually loved in the North. She
Yeah.
became a government worker. She worked in
Mm,
several aspects of the federal government bureaucracy because she was short on money. That's the main reason why I think all these women were writing, at least the
mm,
Camerons and LaSalle Pickett. There was money in it. There was money in public speaking.
mm,
And 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 she made a real point of reaching out to Union veterans, and
mm,
they appreciate. And she did when she visited the Gettysburg battlefield for one of the key reunions, and they appreciated that.
mm,
And she always gave the impression that Pickett respected his Union enemies, and George, that is, and uh, you know. I was surprised how many Northerners bought into all this, but they did,
mm,
and that's a point that I think David Blight makes extremely well in Race and Reunion. That the Northern magazine publishers, for instance,
mm,
wanted to sell, and they were just inviting Southerners to publish in their magazines and others with Civil War stories, and they wanted to suppress controversial,
mm, mm,
confrontational kinds of content. And so the whole idea of the reunions, the Civil War
mm,
reunions, where the veterans shook hands, you know,
mm,
across the stone wall at Gettysburg and that kind of thing, um, from both sides, and had joint big bashes, big
mm,
feasts to celebrate reunion. And yes, as Caroline Janney points out so well, the bitterness wasn't really buried, and there were plenty of people who were still bitter. And certainly, this is the case in the Union
mm,
as segregation comes in, and the more liberal aspects of the war get swept aside. But I think nonetheless, I can show and do show, I think, through the Lost Cause that there were a lot of Northerners who do buy into it. But I
mm,
think the evidence is pretty strong that the stories come out of the South and then play into a North, which allows
mm,
segregation and
mm,
discrimination and disenfranchisement
mm,
to sweep over, after all,
mm,
a conquered country. I mean,
mm,
or a conquered part of America.
mm,
And the North should have been writing the terms, and maybe they did for a few years, very few. It's amazing how
mm,
I think most Americans have this idea that Reconstruction lasted a long time. Well,
mm,
it
mm,
arguably lasted up to 10 years in a
mm,
state like South Carolina. But some of them, like Georgia, as
mm,
you know well, it was over almost immediately.
mm,
And the North had conquered the South,
mm,
and the South had committed treason, and yet they're writing the terms so that when Woodrow Wilson comes into the White House, you got a
mm,
white Virginian as president, and he's segregating
mm,
much of the federal bureaucracy, and
mm,
no one seems, and he's praising you know, film that. that glorifies the Ku Klux Klan, and this is all Birth of a Nation. It's all well and good, and many Northerners promoted and repeated this legend and elaborated on it. So everyone who tells the legend they often come up with new little twists, little details. They change the kind of wood that was burned or which room in the master's house it was burned, and so on and so forth. The details change, but the overall idea is that really slavery wasn't so bad. So why were they fighting a civil war over it?
Yeah. Now we're getting on the hour and a half mark slowly here for our
Yeah.
conversation. So I have one more episode that I definitely want to talk about because it's towards the end of your book, and it was sort of something that I felt was almost a little depressing, but worth talking about. And that's where you talk about the National Park Service, which today owns the Booker T. Washington birthplace site, putting on a Yule log event, and how much Booker T. Washington actually promoted on some level that mythology.
Yes, and I'll go quick on this, but to the degree that African Americans have bought into this legend, and I argue that very few have actually.
Mm,
But those who have, I think most of them have been influenced by Booker T. Washington.
mm,
Booker T. Washington himself was exposed to the legend. He lived in an area of the country where inns Randolph and Camerons
mm,
weren't that far away. He was a reader. He was extremely well read. He was connected with Hampton College. That's where he
mhm,
graduated from, and their magazine had a Yule log story right in the middle of when Booker T. Washington's promoting all this, and he elaborates the soaking myth after
mm,
a couple years after the story appears in the Hampton College magazine,
mm,
by a white woman who's
mm,
connected to a Confederate major.
mm,
So this is all connected. But at any rate, Booker T. Washington,
mm,
if you know anything about him, he's generally devotes his career to not only dominating black political life if he can in the
mm,
country, but also he wants financing for Tuskegee, which he's the principal of,
mm,
and he needs to appease white
mm,
philanthropists and Alabama legislators to get
mm,
funding. And he develops a very conciliatory approach to race
mm,
relations rather than being abrasive, like
mhm,
in your face, you might say, like W.E.B. Du Bois, his
mhm,
contemporary and rival. Booker T. Washington is trying to bring people together, and that was the whole purpose of his famous
mm,
Atlanta Compromise speech, in which he sort of said, we'll take segregation
mm,
and forfeit integration if you give us economic opportunity in the South. So, anyway, with that in mind, Booker T. Washington, in a couple of publications, in his famous autobiography, Up from Slavery, which was rated one of the 100 most important books of the 20th century by the Modern American Library, and widely read, and I read as a kid. Uh, and then a magazine article that got used a lot, got republished and then used by the Booker T. Washington National Monument in the Roanoke area. This monument did it, and so his reflections get promoted by the monument, which not only has programs devoted to
mm,
the Yule log, but has published his memoirs online,
mm,
which promote this. And I don't have time to go into it, but I will just make, I think, the necessary point that when Booker T. Washington said that Virginia's slaves got long Christmas holidays by Yule logs, he said specifically plantation slaves. Now, he
mm,
was a child on a Virginia small farm that had just a
mhm,
handful of slaves. He did not grow up on a plantation. He never said in either of his
mm,
memoirs that he saw a Yule log burn anywhere.
mm,
He just sort of gave it out as a general fact that they were
mm,
without a single piece of evidence or even an
Mm.
indication that he had somewhere in his
Mm.
pile of papers or desk or whatever
Mm.
evidence that a Yule log burned, or even that someone had told him.
Right.
We don't know where the story came from. He just presented it as given
Mm.
fact and history, and it's bad history.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is sad because he is such an important figure that we want to have as a kind of voice of for people to find inspiration with.
Well, let me finish with just one final musing. I think these stories are so colorful that they
Mm,
sell. And
yes.
and so why not put it in? It's fun to read these
Right.
stories, and they
Yeah.
have colorful poems, and so one black woman in the 20th century titled her 500-page genealogy. I think it was 500 pages, when the Yule log burned or something like
Mm,
that, and she mentions in it that she heard this story, like fifth hand, from
mm,
a great, coming down from great grandparents who talked to slaves who hadn't, to blacks who hadn't even been enslaved themselves about what their parents in turn had
mm,
experienced. She gives it a paragraph or two and titles the whole book with the legend because it's a colorful legend and it attracts
mm,
attention.
yeah.
But it's really sad. Certainly not
Mm,
every slave. The legend suggests every slave
mm.
enjoyed a Yule log vacation, and they enjoyed something much less.
And a great end line, but I have one last one. I always like to, in books of this nature, I always like to ask the author, what was your favorite one? What was the most as a like the most surprising stories that you discovered, or the most like moment where you just kind of like you read it, you walked out of the room to the kitchen to tell Jill, like what was the sort of most like moment where you kind of were like,
Well, the
wow.
one that threw me the most was the one, those two newspaper articles from before the Civil War, which said
Mm,
that slaves had a Yule log holiday,
mm,
and that it was and that the Yule log, I think at least one of them said the Yule log was soaked.
mm,
And that was the biggest because at that point I would have dropped the whole project. As to the myth itself, as myth, I suppose it was when I discovered all the truth about LaSalle Pickett and I started
mm,
reading Gary Gallagher's worth about how he didn't talk about the Yule log business at all, but he talked about so much she lied
mm,
in her work on General Pickett, and she actually went to the point of plagiarizing letters and
mm,
claiming that they were letters he had sent her during the
mm,
war. And Gary Gallagher just totally exposes it, and that was eye-opening. So then I found out all the other lies she told in her
mm,
writing, and I said to myself, "Boy, if this woman told lies about that, she told a lie about Abraham Lincoln." Who supposedly visited her in Richmond right after Lee's army evacuated Richmond at the end of the war. And
mm,
supposedly Lincoln called on the picket lodging in Richmond to pay his compliments to LaSalle Pickett. And when
mm,
I found that out and it said, oh boy, I've got to look closely at her work. And then I discovered everything that she had written on Yule log, three separate or four separate publications on Yule log. And one of them I'll let readers find out for themselves. But one of them is a great story about an elderly black man in the Virginia mountains and his Yule log for Christmas. And it is in total contradiction of
mm,
all the other stories she told about Yule logs. I don't know why she wrote this particular story. I've never found out. It's in many ways sort of an admirable story,
yeah,
but it sure opened my eyes too. So there were
mm,
many eye popping moments. And then, like you, finding out the truth about, for instance, the Westville Yule log ceremony and what you got to be. I have always, as most historians of the U.S., I think, worship the Library of Congress. I mean, it's up there at the pinnacle. I just love the place and have worshipped it. And to find out that
Mm,
their local legacies project had
mm,
so little fact checking
mm.
behind it
Yeah.
was a big shock. And answer your question, no one shock. I was being shocked every day, and I was coming in to my wife, Jill, and I was saying, oh boy, you'll never guess what I came up with today.
Well, you always had a good conversation.
Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
yeah. Well, this was a amazing conversation to talk about Christmas stories and the myth that we tell about Christmas in different ways, different places at different times. We are not going to reveal what Bob's final verdict is on the Yule log. You can find that out in the book if you want to read that. We'll keep that as a sort of little spoilers that we're not going to give away. And of course, if you're interested in the book, it's Bloomsbury Publications, and it's Debunking the Yule log myth, the disturbing history of a plantation legend. So
Thank you
thank
very
you.
much. I appreciate being here with you for the podcast.
I thank you for the time you took.